Look at Canada on a modern map, and it appears almost permanent. An enormous country stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific and northward into the Arctic, bordered by 3 oceans and shaped by immense forests, mountain ranges, grasslands, tundra, rivers, islands, and more lakes than most of us could ever imagine visiting in a lifetime. Yet the Canada we recognize today is only the newest layer of a human story that began thousands of years before the country itself existed. When most people think about the origins of Canada, they think of Confederation in 1867, French explorers traveling along the St. Lawrence River, British colonies expanding across North America, or perhaps the rivalry between France and Britain that eventually determined which empire would control much of the northern continent. But if we begin there, we enter the story incredibly late, because long before Toronto, Montreal, Quebec City, Vancouver, or Ottawa existed, long before anyone spoke English or French on these lands, and long before the word Canada appeared on a European map, human communities were already living across these enormous northern landscapes, adapting to changing climates, developing languages and political traditions, establishing trade networks, creating technologies suited to environments ranging from the Pacific coast to the Arctic, and passing knowledge from one generation to another across an extraordinary span of time. The true origin of Canada, therefore, cannot be found in one date, one explorer, one empire, or one political agreement, because the land that eventually became Canada existed within several different human worlds before those worlds collided and became connected in ways that would transform all of them. To understand that deeper history, we have to travel backward beyond Confederation, beyond British rule, beyond New France, beyond Jacques Cartier, and even beyond the Norse voyages across the North Atlantic, until the borders of modern Canada disappear completely, and we enter a landscape shaped by the final stages of the Ice Age, when enormous glaciers covered much of northern North America. Sea levels were different, coastlines existed where there is now open water, and human populations were moving through the wider Americas during one of the most remarkable chapters of human migration. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten origins of nations, ancient peoples, migrations, civilizations, and the events hidden beneath the history we normally learn, subscribe to the Historixa and join us as we travel beyond familiar dates and famous names, because the story of Canada becomes far more fascinating when we stop beginning in 1867 and instead ask what existed here before Canada had a flag, before it had borders, and even before it had a name. To begin that journey, imagine standing somewhere in northern North America near the end of the last ice age and attempting to recognize the country around you, because much of the geography would seem completely unfamiliar. Enormous ice sheets, particularly the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, had covered vast areas of what is now Canada, shaping the land beneath them through immense pressure and movement, while glaciers carved valleys, altered drainage systems, transported enormous quantities of rock and sediment, and contributed to the formation of the landscapes that would eventually become associated with Canada. As the climate warmed and the ice gradually retreated, territories that had been inaccessible became habitable, ecosystems shifted northward, animals expanded into newly exposed landscapes, rivers and lakes formed or changed their courses, and human communities adapted to a continent undergoing enormous environmental transformation. For generations, one of the most familiar explanations for the early peopling of the Americas focused on populations whose ancestry was connected to Northeast Asia, moving through Beringia, the vast Ice Age region encompassing parts of present-day Siberia, Alaska, and areas now submerged beneath the Bering Sea. But describing Beringia simply as a narrow bridge between two continents creates the wrong image, because it was itself an enormous landscape in which people and animals could live and move. The timing and routes of the earliest migrations into and through the Americas remain subjects of continuing archaeological and genetic research, and older textbook versions that imagined one simple migration followed by movement through an ice-free corridor have increasingly given way to a more complicated picture in which coastal movement may also have played an important role, and archaeological discoveries continue to challenge assumptions about exactly when different regions were first inhabited. What is beyond dispute is that the ancestors of indigenous peoples were present in the Americas thousands of years before Europeans crossed the Atlantic, and over enormous stretches of time, their descendants adapted to environments that differed dramatically from one another. This is important because there was never one single indigenous culture covering the enormous territory that would eventually become Canada, just as there was never one single language, political system, economy, or way of living shared by every community from the Atlantic to the Pacific and Arctic. Along the northwest coast, societies developed within environments rich in marine and river resources and created complex communities with distinctive artistic, ceremonial, economic, and political traditions. While across the plains, peoples adapted to immense grasslands and changing animal populations, and throughout the eastern woodlands and Great Lakes regions, communities developed combinations of agriculture, hunting, fishing, settlement, diplomacy, and trade suited to local conditions. Across the subarctic and Arctic, generations of human experience produced extraordinary knowledge of environments that could appear almost impossible to outsiders, allowing communities to travel, hunt, build shelter, make clothing, navigate sea ice, and survive extreme seasonal changes across enormous distances. Long before Europeans constructed colonial roads or trading posts, rivers and lakes formed an immense transportation network connecting communities across the continent, while trade routes allowed copper, stone, shells, food, tools, knowledge, stories, and technologies to travel far beyond the places where they originated. The landscapes that Europeans would later describe as wilderness were therefore not empty spaces waiting to be discovered, but inhabited territories that had already been named, traveled, understood, and connected through generations of human relationships. And when Europeans eventually entered these environments, their survival and expansion frequently depended upon indigenous geographic knowledge, technologies, diplomacy, transportation systems, and existing networks. Across these vast territories lived many distinct peoples whose histories cannot be reduced to one narrative, including Algonquian-speaking peoples across extensive areas of eastern and central regions, Iroquoian-speaking societies in parts of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence regions, diverse nations of the plains, peoples of the northwest coast, subarctic communities, and Arctic peoples whose histories included later Inuit expansion across the Arctic. The Métis emerged much later through particular historical communities connected especially to relationships between indigenous peoples and Europeans within the fur trade world, developing into a distinct people with their own culture, political traditions, communities, and identity. These histories remind us that indigenous peoples were not simply populations existing in the background before the beginning of Canadian history, because they already possessed histories of their own that stretched backward across generations before any European power claimed territory in northern North America. By the time Europeans approached these shores, indigenous nations already had alliances, rivalries, trade relationships, territories, political systems, spiritual traditions, technologies, and memories connecting communities with particular landscapes, which means that they were not waiting for a country called Canada to appear and were certainly not waiting to be discovered. They were living within societies whose histories existed independently of France, Britain, or any future Canadian state, and for thousands of years the human story of northern North America unfolded without knowledge of the European empires that would eventually cross the Atlantic and attempt to claim enormous territories they barely understood. Then another human world approached from the east, although the first known Europeans to establish a presence in what is now Canada were not the French or British explorers usually associated with the beginning of colonial history, but Norse seafarers whose voyages across the North Atlantic carried them through a chain of settlements and routes connecting Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, and eventually the northeastern edge of North America. Around the year 1000, Norse voyagers reached Newfoundland, and at L'Anse-aux-Meadows, archaeologists discovered the remains of a Norse site that provided extraordinary physical evidence that Europeans had reached North America centuries before Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic, including buildings constructed in a recognizable Norse style and evidence of ironworking that connected this distant location to the wider Norse Atlantic world. For a brief period, two enormous histories of human migration had reached opposite sides of the same ocean and finally touched the same region because the ancestors of indigenous peoples had entered the Americas through ancient migrations extending thousands of years into the past, while the Norse had reached Newfoundland through a completely different chain of movement extending westward across Europe and the North Atlantic. Norse written traditions describe encounters with indigenous peoples in lands west of Greenland, although those accounts must be interpreted carefully, and archaeological evidence confirms that Norse people were present at L'Anse-aux-Meadows. But whatever ambitions may have brought them there, their presence did not develop into a lasting European colonization of what is now Canada, and after the Norse settlement was abandoned, centuries would pass before European powers returned in a way that permanently transformed the political and demographic future of northern North America. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, European maritime expansion had entered a new phase as kingdoms competed for trade routes, territory, resources, and influence across the Atlantic, while improvements in navigation and shipbuilding made longer voyages increasingly possible. John Cabot sailed under the English crown in 1497 and reached the North Atlantic coast of North America, although the precise location of his landfall remains debated, while Portuguese, Basque, French, English, and other European fishers and whalers increasingly entered Atlantic waters around Newfoundland and Labrador, drawn particularly by the extraordinary marine resources of the region. These voyages did not enter an empty Atlantic world, because indigenous coastal communities already knew these environments intimately, and the growing European presence gradually created new zones of trade, contact, competition, and eventually colonization. Among the waterways that would become central to this changing world, none would become more important to the French colonial project than the St. Lawrence River, because this enormous river system provided access deep into the continent and eventually became one of the foundations upon which New France developed. In 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence under the authority of King Francis I of France, and during later voyages he traveled farther into the river system and encountered indigenous communities, including the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, associated with places Europeans recorded as Stadacona and Hochelaga. These encounters occurred within a landscape that already possessed its own political and cultural geography, but European maps would increasingly impose new names and claims upon it. Even the name Canada emerged from this world of contact, because it is generally traced to the St. Lawrence Iroquoian word kanata, meaning a village or settlement, which Cartier heard and recorded during his interactions in the region. Over time, Europeans expanded the geographical meaning of the word until Canada eventually came to describe a territory vastly larger than the community to which the term had originally referred, creating one of history's remarkable linguistic transformations in which an indigenous word connected to a local settlement ultimately became the name of one of the largest countries on Earth. Yet the Canada Cartier encountered was not a country and could not have been recognized as one by the people living there because it remained a vast collection of indigenous territories, while France was only beginning to imagine a colonial future in northern North America. early French attempts at permanent settlement struggled, but by the beginning of the 17th century, French ambitions became more organized, and Samuel de Champlain emerged as one of the central figures in the establishment of New France. In 1608, Champlain founded Quebec on the St. Lawrence River, creating a settlement that would become one of the most important centers of French power in North America. But the survival of New France depended upon far more than European determination, because French colonists entered an indigenous political world in which alliances and relationships were essential. The French developed important alliances with indigenous nations, including the Wendat and various Algonquin and Innu communities, while becoming drawn into existing rivalries and conflicts involving other nations, particularly the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. These relationships were never simply a matter of Europeans controlling indigenous peoples, because indigenous nations pursued their own political, military, and economic interests and used alliances strategically within a rapidly changing world, while the relatively small French population depended heavily upon indigenous partners for trade, transportation, diplomacy, geographic knowledge, and military support. At the center of many of these relationships was the fur trade, particularly the enormous European demand for beaver pelts used in the production of felt hats. Rivers became commercial arteries connecting distant interior regions with colonial settlements and eventually European markets, while canoes traveled enormous distances, carrying furs, manufactured goods, food, messages, and people between communities. Indigenous knowledge and transportation technologies made these networks possible, while French traders, missionaries, voyageurs, and settlers increasingly moved through the continent, creating relationships that could involve cooperation, intermarriage, religious conversion, economic opportunity, cultural exchange, competition, and conflict. The fur trade helped create new communities and identities, particularly in regions where indigenous women and European men formed families whose descendants developed distinctive cultures connected to both worlds, contributing eventually to the emergence of Métis communities, especially within the Western fur trade networks. The development of these communities reminds us that Canadian history was never simply a confrontation between two completely separate populations, because contact also produced families, languages, economies, identities, and political communities that could not be understood as exclusively European or indigenous. At the same time, however, European arrival brought catastrophe on a scale that cannot be separated from the creation of colonial Canada, because infectious diseases introduced through expanding Atlantic contact devastated many indigenous communities whose populations had little previous exposure to pathogens such as smallpox. Disease could move through trade networks ahead of direct European settlement, weakening communities, disrupting political relationships, reducing populations, and creating demographic transformations whose consequences lasted for generations, while warfare, displacement, competition over resources, and expanding colonial settlement added further pressures. As New France expanded, another European empire was also becoming increasingly powerful in North America, and the rivalry between France and Britain gradually transformed the continent into part of a much larger imperial struggle. Both empires developed relationships with different indigenous nations, and indigenous diplomacy remained central because neither France nor Britain operated within an empty landscape. Indigenous nations made strategic choices according to their own interests, sometimes supporting one European power, sometimes another, and sometimes attempting to maintain independence from both. The struggle between France and Britain eventually became part of the global 7 Years' War, and in North America the conflict culminated in a series of campaigns that would determine the future of New France. In 1759, British forces under James Wolfe confronted French forces under Louis-Joseph de Montcalm near Quebec in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. and although both commanders were mortally wounded, the British victory became a decisive moment in the conquest of New France. Montreal surrendered the following year, and in 1763 the Treaty of Paris formally transferred most French possessions in mainland North America to Britain. Yet Britain had not conquered a culturally empty territory. Tens of thousands of French-speaking Catholic inhabitants remained. Indigenous nations continued to possess their own territories and political interests, and the British government now faced the challenge of governing populations with languages, religions, legal traditions, and histories different from those of Britain itself. The Quebec Act of 1774 preserved important aspects of French civil law and allowed the continued practice of Catholicism, helping establish a pattern in which the coexistence of French and British institutions would become one of the defining tensions and characteristics of the future Canada. Then events farther south transformed British North America again when 13 British colonies rebelled against Britain and created the United States. The American Revolution did not simply create a new country. It also changed the demographic and political future of the northern colonies because tens of thousands of loyalists who remained aligned with the British Crown moved northward, settling in regions that included Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and what would later become Ontario. Their arrival expanded English-speaking populations and helped reshape the political geography of British North America. The border between British North America and the United States remained uncertain and contested, and during the War of 1812, the United States invaded British territory in several campaigns, while British forces, colonial militia, and Indigenous allies resisted. The war ended without the United States conquering British North America, but it became important in later Canadian historical memory because it reinforced the political separation between the northern colonies and the expanding republic to the south. Throughout the 19th century, British North America continued changing as populations grew, immigration increased, cities expanded, transportation networks developed, and political demands for more responsible government intensified, while tensions between English-speaking and French-speaking communities remained central to colonial politics. At the same time, the colonial expansion that eventually produced modern Canada placed enormous pressure upon Indigenous peoples through land dispossession, treaty processes, resource expansion, settlement, and government policies that increasingly attempted to control Indigenous lands, cultures, and communities. By the 1860s, several pressures encouraged political leaders in British North America to consider federation, including economic concerns, political instability, defense anxieties related to the United States, and the practical advantages of creating a larger political union. After negotiations among colonial representatives, the British North America Act came into effect on July 1, 1867, creating the Dominion of Canada from Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. Canada had finally appeared as a political country, but even then, the map was far from complete. The new Dominion expanded rapidly westward and northward, acquiring enormous territories previously administered through the Hudson's Bay Company and negotiating the entry or creation of additional provinces, while British Columbia joined Confederation in 1871 and Prince Edward Island followed in 1873. Newfoundland remained outside Canada until 1949, meaning that the borders familiar to Canadians today emerged gradually rather than appearing fully formed at Confederation. This expansion also brought some of the most difficult and consequential parts of Canadian history into sharper focus because the growth of the Canadian state occurred across territories already inhabited by First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Treaties were negotiated under circumstances that remained central to legal and historical debates. Métis resistance emerged as communities defended political and territorial interests, and government policies increasingly sought to assimilate Indigenous peoples. The residential school system separated generations of Indigenous children from their families and communities, suppressing languages and cultures and causing profound harms whose consequences continue to shape Canada today. Understanding the origin of Canada therefore requires us to hold two realities together: the development of a country that eventually built democratic institutions and a distinct national identity, and the colonial processes through which that expansion frequently came at enormous cost to Indigenous peoples. Over time, Canada also became increasingly independent from Britain through a gradual constitutional evolution rather than one single revolutionary break. Canadian participation in the First and Second World Wars contributed to changing ideas of national identity and international status. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 recognized substantial legislative independence, and the patriation of the Constitution in 1982 brought the country's constitutional framework under full Canadian control while introducing the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms as a central part of modern constitutional life. Yet if we return to the question with which we began and ask where Canada truly came from, even Confederation now seems like only one moment inside a much larger story, because beneath the political nation created in 1867 lie thousands of years of Indigenous history, ancient migrations into the Americas, generations of adaptation to forests, plains, mountains, coasts, and Arctic environments, extensive Indigenous trade networks, Norse voyages across the Atlantic, French exploration and settlement, Indigenous European alliances, the fur trade, British conquest, loyalist migration, wars, political negotiations, colonial expansion, immigration, and the gradual creation of a country whose modern identity emerged from all of these histories interacting with one another. Canada was therefore not born in a single moment, and it was not created by one people alone. The country emerged slowly from landscapes that had already been inhabited for thousands of years, from encounters between Indigenous nations and newcomers arriving from across the Atlantic, from the rivalry of empires, from communities speaking different languages and following different traditions, and eventually from political negotiations that created a federation across an enormous portion of northern North America. The familiar red and white flag, the modern provinces and territories, and the borders we recognize today belong to the newest layer of that story, while beneath them remain much older histories that cannot be understood through a modern map alone. Perhaps that is the most important lesson hidden inside the origin of Canada, because nations often tell their histories as though the country itself was always waiting to exist, as though every event naturally led toward the borders and institutions we know today, but the people who lived through these moments could not see the future. The Indigenous communities living along the St. Lawrence before European arrival did not know that an Indigenous word for a settlement would eventually become the name of a vast country. The Norse who reached Newfoundland could not know that centuries later, European empires would compete for control of the continent. French settlers building Quebec could not know that New France would eventually fall to Britain. Loyalists fleeing the American Revolution could not know that their descendants would become part of a separate Canadian nation. And the political leaders negotiating Confederation in 1867 could not fully imagine the country Canada would become more than a century later. The deeper we travel into this history, the more Canada begins to resemble not one origin story but a meeting place of many stories, some ancient and some relatively recent, some shaped by cooperation and others by conflict, some celebrated and others painful enough that the country continues to confront their consequences today. The land remembers Indigenous histories far older than Confederation. The names of rivers and communities preserve traces of languages that existed before European settlement. Archaeological sites reveal worlds that disappeared thousands of years ago. and modern Canada continues to carry the cultural influence of Indigenous peoples, French and British colonial histories, later immigration from around the world, and generations of people who arrived carrying their own languages, traditions, memories, and ideas of home. And perhaps this is why asking where Canada came from ultimately tells us something larger about the way nations are created, because a country can have an official birthday while the human history beneath it is immeasurably older. Canada celebrates July 1st, 1867, as the beginning of Confederation. But the story of these lands did not begin that morning, and understanding Canada requires us to look beneath the political date toward the thousands of years of human experience that came before it. The country we see today is only the latest chapter of a story still being written, shaped by people whose ancestors arrived at vastly different moments, yet whose histories eventually became connected within the same enormous landscape. If this journey has changed the way you think about the origins of Canada, continue exploring with one of the suggested videos appearing on your screen now, where we travel even deeper into the forgotten migrations, ancient peoples, civilizations, and events that shaped the world long before modern borders existed. And if you have not already, subscribe to the Historixa so you can join us for the next journey into the hidden past. Thank you for watching, thank you for exploring this extraordinary history with us, and most importantly, thank you for being part of the Historixa family, because every nation has a story written in history, but beneath that history, there is always an older story waiting to be discovered.